We have a criminal living in the White House. Ambassador Sondland, by his own words, told us that everyone was in the loop.
I learned something about these impeachment trials. I learned, number one, that Donald Trump doesn't want me to be the nominee.
We cannot simply be consumed by Donald Trump, because if we are, you know what? We're going to lose the election.
More agreement than disagreement at Wednesday night's Democratic debate in Atlanta. Most of the fire directed at Donald Trump, not surprising, given a bombshell day at the impeachment hearings. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Later on, we'll be talking to Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times op-ed columnist Bret Stephens. We begin with politics, with the first votes being cast in Iowa a little more than 2 months from now. It was a high-stakes debate. Pete Buttigieg, this 37-year-old mayor of South Bend, Indiana, jumped to the top spot in a Des Moines Register CNN poll in Iowa this week. It was expected that he would be a political piñata. Because of that, he wasn't. But he did have to respond to some heat about his lack of support among African-American voters.
While I do not have the experience of ever having been discriminated against because of the color of my skin, I do have the experience of sometimes feeling like a stranger in my own country, turning on the news and seeing my own rights come up for debate.
The takeaways from the debate, which include the performance of Joe Biden, are just one of the major stories in a virtual avalanche of political news. Among them, what impact will Michael Bloomberg and Deval Patrick have on the Democratic race? And will the political fallout from the likely impeachment of Donald Trump be a major factor on the campaign? We're joined by Jonathan Ellis, a senior politics editor at the New York Times. Johanna Barr is also a senior politics editor at the Times, and Eleanor Randolph, a contributing writer at the Times and the author of The Many Lives of Michael Bloomberg, a definitive biography of the billionaire former mayor, now a must-read in this political environment. So many of us saw the debate this week in Atlanta. Did it change anything?
You know, that's a good question, Sam. So much of the political oxygen has been sucked out of the room by the impeachment hearings that it almost seemed like a lot of the candidates didn't necessarily even bring their A games to this debate, or it sort of seemed like a scrimmage almost, where you don't really want to deliver the biggest hits. It's more of a practice round. So a lot of the candidates really came with a little bit more of a kumbaya spirit, I guess. There was, as you said, there was more agreement than disagreement, and even though there were some strong performances by some of the candidates on the outer edges of the stage, it does raise the question whether this debate is really going to change anything.
Joanna, you said earlier you were going to Iowa, or will be soon. I hope you're dressed warmly. How are the candidates going to distinguish themselves then between now and the caucuses?
It's a great question. I mean, as you said,
Thanks, both of you.
You're very welcome.
I'm trying to ask good questions.
You know, less than 3 months away, the Iowa caucuses, but a lot can change until then. And there's another debate happening next month. You know, and who is going to get momentum, who's going to sustain momentum. Cory Booker had a very strong night last night and, you know, has pulled a lot of donations in, you know, the past 12 hours as a result of that, but has not qualified for the Democratic debate in December yet. So there's a question of whether or not he'll be on stage. There's a question of whether Pete Buttigieg will be able to keep the edge in Iowa, or if, you know, Warren or Biden are going to take it back. And there's going to be lots of movement, so it's hard to say at this point.
Eleanor?
Well, one of the things I keep wondering about, and it's not really part of the debate, it's part of the impeachment hearings, is how does that really affect Joe Biden? You know, if you listen to the Republicans, it almost doesn't matter what they say. They're just saying Biden, corruption, Ukraine, just sort of over and over, taking those three words and sort of trying to imprint them on the foreheads of voters across the country. And I don't know, he was okay in that debate. He messed up a couple of times, but I don't know, I've covered Joe Biden for years and years, and he always, I mean, he talks so much usually that he's almost always tripping over himself or causing some, he was gaffe prone. That was always what we knew about Joe Biden.
And is a bigger problem, though, and I'm just asking this hypothetically, that Joe Biden represents something that came before, when he even describes himself as part of the Obama team, which arguably is a plus. That happened, before this, and all the other candidates are sort of looking more forward. Is that a plus by any means?
I mean, ideologically speaking, the terms of the debate have been set by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and many of the candidates are, debate after debate, they're having to respond to their proposals and the way they've reframed the narrative on stage. So, for Democratic primary voters, it's possible that Joe Biden is going to be viewed as either a return to normalcy, as you're mentioning, or someone
whatever
who is out,
normalcy means.
whatever normalcy means, or he's out of step with, the direction that some of the debate is shifting towards.
Let's remember it was Warren Harding who sought a return to normalcy. I'm not sure that's really what we want. The fact that Bloomberg is toying with the race and may actually get into it, Eleanor, what does that say about Joe Biden's chances? We were saying early on that Bloomberg was not going to get into the race because Joe Biden was there as the moderate, as the centrist. Does this mean Bloomberg, and especially the people around him who are really political pros, think that Biden is not going to make it?
Well, they're worried. I mean, what Bloomberg says and what his people say is that the main thing they want is to get rid of Donald Trump, to defeat him in 2020. And so right now they're on two tracks. They're preparing in case he wants to announce that he wants to run, mainly focusing on Super Tuesday, which is March 3rd. And that is about 40% of the delegates, the Democratic Party delegates, and that's, the big one. But at the same time, he's decided he's going to spend $100 million in key states with digital ads that they won't feature Bloomberg, but they'll say at the bottom something like Bloomberg paid for this.
Digital meaning online.
Yes, and then also up to $20 million to register more Democratic voters in these key states. So what Howard Wolfson is saying now is that they're sort of working on two tracks, and if he runs, this, $150 million will help, but if he doesn't run, it will still help.
It will still help in terms of getting rid of Trump.
That's right.
Is there a fail-safe date by which he has to say yes or no? And how much of that depends on how Biden is doing? Jonathan, do you have any sense?
I'm not sure that there's a fail-safe date, but it certainly seems like he's moving closer and closer to announcing that he will be in the race. He's filing all this required paperwork. But he's also pursuing, speaking of fail-safe dates, he's pursuing this interesting strategy of basically skipping the first four primaries and caucuses and going straight to Super Tuesday, as you said, Eleanor. And that has not really worked out for anyone who's
like
tried
Rudy
it.
Giuliani.
Yeah. So Mr. Bloomberg obviously thinks that he might be able to pull it off differently, but it's quite a risky strategy.
Although we have to say Bloomberg has got better political strategists around him than Mayor Giuliani did. Joanna, what do you think? Is this potentially good strategy on the part of Mayor Bloomberg?
Well, polls tend to show that the Democratic electorate is generally satisfied with the number of candidates they have, and people are actually hoping for the field to shrink and not to grow. That being said, he's given so much money to so many Democratic causes, and one can argue he's earned his spot to have a say in the race. the early voting states, there's the argument that Iowa and New Hampshire, for example, are very white and don't represent, the broad electorate, and less attention should be paid to them overall. But then there are also people who think that you should respect the process, and all the other candidates are spending so much time on the ground, in these two states and in Nevada and in South Carolina, and maybe, Bloomberg should be doing that too. So it's an open question.
Jonathan and Joanna, what about Deval Patrick? What is his strategy?
He's a close friend of President Obama's, so I think he may see himself as sort of the heir to the Obama coalition in a way, and like Bloomberg, sort of sees that there is not one particularly strong more moderate or centrist candidate doing well right now, even though Biden is still leading in the polls. He's certainly not invulnerable. So I think Patrick may see a path to try to recreate that coalition, but he is starting so late, and he doesn't have the billions of dollars that Mike Bloomberg does.
Yeah, scheduled an event, yesterday at Morehouse College, historically black college in Atlanta, and they had to cancel it when nobody showed up.
It's not a good sign.
There was an empty photo of the room being circulated on the internet. So like you said, it's just very late, and as we saw yesterday on the debate stage, there are several candidates who are pitching themselves as the more moderate alternative, and the words Obama coalition were used, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Joe Biden. So it's a question of whether or not that's really a space that
Eleanor,
is open.
two quick questions. Do we know whether Mayor Bloomberg has spoken to Joe Biden since he made his decision?
Made this decision. I don't know whether he has. I know he spoke to him before, in March, he declared that he was not going to run.
Right.
He looked at it. And I know that he spoke to Biden then. I don't know whether he's spoken to him since. It would make sense for him to have given him a heads up that he was going to do this.
And what do you think Biden would have said?
I think he would be angry.
Uh-huh.
I was trying to avoid the word that came to mind there.
You avoid the language that we're hearing at the impeachment hearing.
But one of the things I was thinking, just listening to the pros here, what if you have Buttigieg in Iowa, you have Warren or Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire, and then Biden comes in and he takes South Carolina, and it goes like that, and it starts bouncing around. Every political reporter in the business has always hoped for a brokered convention, and it probably won't happen, but underneath there's this little sort of heartbeat every time political reporters start talking about this possibility.
Quick last question. Was the Mayor Bloomberg pandering on apologizing for stop and frisk?
I thought he had to do that, and the timing is
Had to do it politically.
He had to do it.
Did he mean it?
Oh, I think he did mean it.
Why didn't he do it 4 years ago,
That's a good question.
2 years ago, or 6 years ago?
Well, he kept thinking he was being disloyal to
Ray
Kelly. But he has heard from Jeffrey Canada. All of his friends have been talking to him over the last 2 years about this huge hole in his legacy.
Thanks to Eleanor Randolph, Joanna Barr, and Jonathan Ellis of the New York Times. Coming up next, Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times op-ed columnist Bret Stephens. Bret Stephens, a relatively young man, just celebrating his 46th birthday. He's already had a long and distinguished career in journalism. He was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, then spent many years at the Wall Street Journal, where he won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. He joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in 2017, writing about foreign policy and domestic politics. Recent columns have included a piece ripping the Turkish tyrant Erdogan visit to the White House, the question of whether Mexico is becoming a failed state, and a reflection on the vindication of never-Trumpers. What is going on in Israel, if you could tell us? We have Prime Minister Netanyahu indicted. We have settlements being approved by the Trump administration. What's happening there?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't think many Israelis know the answer either. I mean, electorally, it now looks like the country is moving to a third election because you've had a succession of ballots in which neither Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, or his principal rival Benny Gantz have been able to form governing coalitions.
So are they as polarized as we are?
No, much less so. I mean, ideologically less so. There would not be a world of difference in terms of actual policy making between a Gantz government and a Netanyahu government, at least when it comes to issues like security, settlements, the economy, different outlooks on social issues. And of course, one of the biggest issues that divides Israeli society is the question of the religious in society. Should they serve in the army? That's been a dividing factor. But now the latest is that as the opposition was unable to form a government, even though it won a plurality of seats in the Knesset, the prime minister has been indicted, and this brings Israel into a kind of terra incognita, legally speaking. I thought I knew the ins and outs of Israeli politics. Turns out I know very little, because it's not clear whether an indicted prime minister needs to step down. It's true that an indicted minister needs to step down, but ministers are appointed rather than elected. The schedule of how this might work is also unclear. So in a way, Israel doesn't have a written constitution, and it is still trying to figure out 71 years into its life, what the laws are, what the rules are, and this is really a first.
Now, you wrote the other day that you rarely agree with the Trump administration, but somewhat surprisingly, you do agree with the administration saying the settlements really don't matter.
Well, what the administration did, the State Department did, is it reversed a 4-page 1978 legal paper by, saying that settlement building was inconsistent with international law, which is different from saying that it's illegal. And I actually don't think it was a huge move, but it certainly garnered a great deal of attention. The truth is that Israel has now been in possession of the West Bank for 52 years. It was in possession of Jordan for just 19 years. Prior to that, there was a British mandate. The basic point I made, that's probably the more controversial one, is that I don't see settlements as really the core issue in Israel's conflict vis-a-vis the Palestinians. That's to say, I don't think the conflict with the Palestinians is fundamentally territorial and about the outcome of the 1967 war. I think it's still more existential about the outcome of the 1948 war. And until that is resolved, I don't think dealing with settlements is particularly helpful. So I thought this actually cleared away some of the cobwebs that have, under which, thinking, real thoughtful, intelligent thinking about how to resolve the conflict has moldered somewhat. And so in that sense, I mean, look, I'm a never Trump conservative, but now and again, the president does something or the administration does something I agree with, and I think it's intellectually honest to acknowledge it.
What you seem to be saying is that the real issue, at least at the moment in the Middle East, is Iran, and things seem to be fairly tumultuous there.
Well, we had 5 days in which the Iranian internet was all but shut down. Amnesty International has credible reports that more than 100 protesters have been killed in demonstrations that have hit something like 130 cities. These demonstrations began initially in reaction to the easing of subsidies on oil. It tells you something about the state of the Iranian economy, that the price of, I think, a liter of oil went to 35 cents to the gallon or the liter. I need to check that. Not very great by Western standards, but enough for the country to erupt in protest. And I don't think it's merely about the economic situation and the effect of U.S. sanctions on Iran. I think it's also about a complex of political issues and a kind of a swelling social discontent that you saw in 2009 during the so-called Green Revolution. You saw it just about a year and a half ago during another round of protests, and it's welling up again.
And what does that portend?
Well, that's obviously extremely hard to say. I mean, look, in Lebanon, there are mass demonstrations, and those demonstrations are in some way aimed against Iran because they're aimed against the control that Iran exercises in that country through Hezbollah. In Iraq, we've had large demonstrations too. Iran's attempt to become, in effect, an imperialist power in the Middle East is meeting with a tremendous amount of resistance abroad, and also I think discontent at home when a lot of Iranians are saying that the regime is funding Hezbollah, it's funding the Houthis in Yemen, and yet it's immiserating its own people at home. Now, a great question, and one to which I don't know the answer, is whether the example of what happened in Syria and other sort of failures of the Arab Spring might deter Iranians from turning protest into rebellion, because what it did in so many other countries was really lead to utter ruin. And that's something we're going to find out.
Are you taking credit for Mayor Bloomberg putting his whole foot, maybe instead of just his toe, into the presidential campaign?
Well, you know, one of the most enjoyable things I do at the Times is I have these biweekly conversations with my wonderful colleague, Gail Collins. And a few weeks ago, I had a line which I said, you know, go to it, you know, Mayor Bloomberg. I have a sense he reads the column. I think my responsibility for his decision is in maybe 0.00001%. I think much more significant is his sense that the moderate lane in the Democratic Party is faltering. Biden is not a good standard bearer for it. That Bloomberg has at least an outside chance, both because he has the money to run and some credibility as a big city mayor who knows how to get things done, and finally because he sees Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders as far too left either to beat Donald Trump or to govern the country responsibly.
So can he win a Democratic nomination and win the election?
Probably not, but he clearly thinks it's worth a shot, and if it costs him $1 billion, that's just 2% of his net worth, at least the last I saw, according to the Forbes list. Look, I think he should try, and by the way, notice that his entry into the race encouraged Deval Patrick, I think, seeing himself as a continuation of the Obama administration, a more moderate strain, a more unifying strain in the Democratic Party, to also check in. I think it's insane that we have a system where if you are not basically announced as a candidate 20 odd months before the election, you're considered a latecomer. I think
still pretty early.
It's still early.
Thanks to Bret Stephens, and I'll add my thoughts on CODA next. Stupidity typically trumps malevolence. Still, sometimes paranoids are right. In a world of cause and effect, coincidence is always suspect. Take the impeachment hearings, please. One bizarre coincidence is the spectral presence of two New York power brokers from the past, Roy Cohn and Jerry Finkelstein. Cohn was disbarred in 1986. He died 5 weeks later. Before that, the ruthless red-baiting political fixer was Donald Trump's mentor. Trump's in trouble for hijacking American foreign aid to Ukraine for his own political goals. No help unless the Ukrainians publicly agree to investigate spurious conspiracy theories, theories that absolved Russia of tampering in the 2016 campaign and implicated Joe Biden in corruption. Think of this plot like a game of telephone. The conspiracy gossip was largely conjured up by associates of Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer. He fed it to John Solomon, a columnist for The Hill. Solomon's reputation for accuracy is a bit shaky. One impeachment hearing witness testified that he couldn't recall a single correct fact in one of Solomon's stories. Then he added charitably, quote, his grammar might have been right. As CNN reported, The Hill is owned by James Finkelstein, whom Roy Cohn once represented in a messy contested will case. Cohn persuaded Schenley liquor magnate Louis Rosenstiel on his deathbed to add his granddaughter as an executor of his estate. The granddaughter was James Finkelstein's wife. A court later ruled that Cohn's conduct was particularly reprehensible because he had opportuned, quote, a hospitalized patient of questionable mental capacity. That was one reason Cohn was later disbarred. James Finkelstein, Jerry's son, and his current wife are tight with the Trumps and friends of Giuliani. His brother is Andy Stein, the former city council president. Andy, meanwhile, has been angling for a sinecure in the Trump administration. When Jerry Finkelstein's two sons were teenagers, Andy wrote Jimmy a letter at boarding school. Andy admitted to never living up to his potential, although some critics say his father's money lifted him beyond it. You have the great opportunity to learn from my mistakes, Andy wrote to Jimmy. I know you are man enough not to let this opportunity go by. Jimmy didn't. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.